faithfully delivering value, interpreting great books from around the world. Hello, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today we'll explore Samuel Huntington's Political Order in Changing Societies. He was an American political scientist. This book was published in 1968, right at the peak of the Vietnam War. The year before, Huntington served as a White House political advisor and wrote a policy report on Vietnam for the U.S. government. Initially, he aimed to analyze Vietnam's socio-political structure, understand why Vietnamese endured for so long, and strategize America's exit from the Vietnam quagmire. However, his Vietnam research uncovered universal political questions that deeply intrigued him. Ultimately, these questions pointed to one core issue. How can developing nations achieve political modernization smoothly? To answer this, we must first clarify what political modernization means.
The author compared three major developed nations, the US, UK, and Soviet Union.
He examined their political systems for commonalities, then traced political modernization's trajectory and direction. Frankly, their systems differed vastly. Soviet decisions came from the Communist Party's Politburo, Britain's from Her Majesty's Parliament, America's from the President, Congress, and Supreme Court. How those seemingly different, careful analysis revealed their similarities outweighed differences. All three had authoritative, efficient governments, robust party systems, high public engagement, civilian military control, broad socioeconomic influence, and orderly leadership transitions. Their governments commanded citizen loyalty, enabling resource mobilization and effective policy implementation. In short, these political systems were strong, fully functional, adaptable, and cohesive. Sadly, most developing nations lack this. Inefficient governance, weakened institutions, fragmented parties, social collapse, escalating conflicts, and rampant violence. Military coups happen one after another, political institutions are weak, and in many cases, some governments have basically stopped governing. Instead, unpredictable autocratic leaders dominate everything, and their social and economic policies are often disastrous.
Officials at all levels are severely corrupt and brazenly violate citizens' rights and freedoms.
Clearly, there's a huge gap in political development between most developing countries and developed nations. This gap isn't about democracy versus autocracy or the specific form of government, but about how effective the government is. In short, whether you're good or bad, you first need the ability to truly govern society. You must have authority before you can constrain it. You need order before you can improve it. And in reality, for most developing countries, what's scarcest isn't resources or capital, but strong political leadership. So what exactly counts as strong political leadership? How can we build strong political leadership? The author thinks we should look for inspiration in the political development history of developed countries. So this time the author focuses on Britain, America, and continental Europe. Before modernization, there was no United States, and Britain and continental Europe were aristocratic feudal systems where power was scattered among various noble lords. In the gaps between noble territories, independent commercial towns survived tenaciously. Beyond the secular power of nobles and merchants, the religious power of the Christian Church permeated every corner of society. Thus, social conflicts and struggles revolved around these forces. With the rise of modern capital power, Europe underwent a major transformation, leaping from a traditional agricultural society to a capitalist, industrial, commercial society. Surprisingly, these conflicts and struggles intensified the growth of capitalism and industry, leading to diversified social labor division, which in turn sparked the rise of various new social forces. For example, professionals like capitalists, teachers, journalists, and engineers actively demanded political participation to protect their interests. However, political resources in Europe at that time were monopolized by feudal nobles and parish bishops who suppressed other emerging social forces, hindered the development of labor division and market systems, and were hypocritical, e.g., conservative in culture, and strictly controlling in ideology. In this situation, emerging social forces are full of vitality but still relatively weak. Therefore, they need a rational, centralized, supreme authority to suppress these nobles and priests. Interestingly, these new forces actually had two ready-made tools within the old state machinery: the monarchy and parliament. What's fascinating is that in medieval and early modern Western Europe, monarchs were often pitted against feudal nobles and church bishops. Those familiar with medieval European history know Western European monarchs had it tough. On one hand, monarchs were merely leaders endorsed by nobles. Without noble support, they lacked absolute authority and constantly guarded against challenges to their power. On the other, above the monarch's secular power stood religious authority, especially medieval popes who threatened excommunication, forcing monarchs to yield. So, for emerging forces supporting the monarchy against feudal and church powers, using royal authority to advance their interests became the optimal strategy. Thus, Western European nations experienced periods of absolute monarchy during capitalist development. This was most evident in France and Germany. Unlike continental Europe, Britain took a different path. Britain's emerging forces didn't rally under the crown, but pursued their goals through the aristocratic parliament. The core principle remained the same: leveraging existing nobility. Parliament, too, was an old institution. They compromised by creating the House of Lords for old nobles, while dominating the House of Commons, Britain's real power center. Whether king, nobles, church, or courts, all answered to Parliament. America's situation differed from both Britain and continental Europe. First, before their parliamentary revolution, the British established North American colonies mirroring their own medieval political features. Authority was highly decentralized. No one held absolute power. Every decision required balancing diverse interests. Society operated through consultation and compromise, organized bottom-up from community self-governance. Secondly, North American colonial society had its own distinct feature: no aristocracy, no feudal conservative forces. People here had to operate by rational principles from the very beginning. Now, these two fundamental characteristics shaped America's political system: a highly decentralized separation of powers. The president represents the medieval English king's authority. Congress represents the medieval English nobility's power. The judiciary represents traditional and common law social forces. These three equal branches check and balance each other, governing civil society rationally. Reviewing British, American, and Western European political history reveals all systems, monarchy, parliament, or separation of powers, share one core feature: they reformed existing institutions. They adapted to rising social forces by accommodating new political demands. So, how should these political systems reform? The author proposes three principles. First, rationalization of authority. Second, specialization of functions. Third, popularization of political participation. What is authority and rationalization? It means rulers' decisions must be reliable and well considered. No impulsive whims. Old regimes were either privately owned by monarchs or nobles, or divine rights administered through churches. The former made capricious decisions. The latter was inscrutable, like heavenly will. Who could guess what deities intended? Thus, rationalizing authority means freeing it from feudal ownership and religious constraints. Now, establishing public institutions that serve collective interests. What about functional specialization? It means creating specialized agencies staffed by professionals for specific tasks. For example, in feudal China, bureaucrats primarily handled judicial cases. Bao Jing, as Kaifeng's governor, an administrative official, spent his days doing judicial work. After the 1911 revolution, China's political machinery began specializing. Roles emerged: president, premier, Congress, ministries, courts, each managing distinct executive, legislative, and judicial functions. This evolution from ancient mixed roles to clearly defined, specialized functions is called functional specialization. What then is popularization of political participation? It means organizing and mobilizing people and social forces to express their interests and engage in political discourse. Simply put, people need accessible platforms to voice concerns and political channels to aggregate public opinion.
Moreover, their opinions must be genuinely heard and impactful. Achieving this is actually quite difficult.
Thus, political modernization essentially means rationalization of political institutions. Specialization and popularization together constitute institutionalization, a societal process where political organizations and procedures gain widespread acceptance and stability. A nation's political development level is primarily measured by whether its political institutionalization is on track. So, what constitutes institutionalization, being on track? The author proposes evaluating institutionalization along four dimensions: adaptability, complexity, autonomy, and internal coherence. Adaptability refers to whether the political system is resilient and flexible enough to transition from traditional to modern industrial commercial society. Specifically, how should old institutions adapt to new realities? By evolving with the times, assigning new missions and goals, and adjusting operational and ideological approaches. For instance, the medieval English Parliament's mission involved nobles gathering to discuss state affairs and constrain royal power. How much tax could the monarch impose on nobles? The amount of labor and military support nobles provided during war and peace all required thorough parliamentary debate and approval before implementation. With modernity's rise, Parliament adjusted its mission to include emerging social forces and reoriented governance to address their interests. Thus, bourgeois representatives replaced nobles in Parliament, inheriting monarch constraining mechanisms to control national finance, trade, diplomacy, and defense, becoming the supreme authority. Measuring a political organization's adaptability requires there is one objective criterion: the organization's lifespan. Clearly, longer organizational lifespans indicate stronger adaptability, or conversely, an organization's stronger adaptability leads to longer survival. As survival of the fittest dictates, history's dustbin is full of political organizations that failed to adapt, like China's imperial system, the Soviet Union, and South Africa's apartheid regime. Another dimension measuring political institutionalization is complexity. Complexity means, first, the system has numerous subordinate organizations with clear hierarchies and distinct responsibilities.
Second, these subunits operate with high specialization. Complexity and adaptability are closely related.
To some extent, a political institution's complexity creates its adaptability. Traditional systems with simpler structures are more easily discarded by progress. Conversely, systems with complex internal structures and diverse functional organizations have greater capacity to adapt to new circumstances and trends. This is because their numerous independent subunits allow some to discover new missions and goals. Japan's Meiji Restoration exemplifies this well. Pre-Restoration, Japan's traditional polity had considerable complexity. Centrally, a symbolic emperor and powerful shogunate. Regionally, various feudal lords, daimyo. Commercial towns dotted between daimyo territories, similar to autonomous European city-states. These early modern merchants possessed significant independence and economic power. The shogunate and daimyo borrowed from merchants during financial shortages and had to repay. When collectors came, daimyo often hid in castles, hardly resembling mighty lords. Thus, when the shogunate declined, the imperial institution, with reformist daimyo and conglomerates, zaibatsu, became instruments for modernization. The third dimension measuring political institutionalization is autonomy. Simply put, how independent are political organizations and procedures from other social groups or behaviors? Simply put, political economy means the state apparatus must be independent. Other social forces like religious groups or classes can't manipulate it at will, and the state refuses to be their political tool. Whoa. The state must not be shackled by the interests or values of these social forces. It should be a public institution serving only public interest, which is the interest of the state itself. We've covered autonomy of political organizations,
Autonomy in political procedures also varies widely.
Autonomy of political procedures means organizations can exclude interference from social forces, like violence, threats, or bribery, and make independent decisions aligned with public interest. Highly developed political systems have their own rules, minimizing internal violence and restricting monetary influence through defined pathways. I couldn't. If a political system can be toppled by a few soldiers or bought cheaply, it has no autonomy whatsoever. Organizations lacking autonomy have two traits. They're prone to rigidity and corruption. Without autonomy, like a puppet controlled by one force, it struggles to accommodate other interests and becomes rigid. It's also vulnerable to coercion or bribery, leading to corruption. Thus, such organizations are easily infiltrated by agents and ideologies from other political systems. For example, Iran's Pahlavi regime, before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, lacked autonomy, became rigid and corrupt, and was easily toppled by mass movements. The Pahlavi system's rigidity was evident in its weak foundation, unable to accommodate interests of urbanites, middle class, workers, rural areas, landless peasants, and religious figures. Corruption included foreign infiltration and bureaucratic graft.
Worse, officials were apathetic and inactive on social issues, so when revolutionaries took to the streets, they lacked even the will to suppress them. Less people practically watched helplessly as the crowd surged forward, and the king fled.
The final dimension measuring political institutionalization is cohesion. The more united an organization, the higher its institutionalization level. Conversely, less unity means lower institutionalization. Actually, understanding it inversely might be more reasonable. Higher institutionalization leads to greater unity. Lower institutionalization leads to disunity. High institutionalization means each member isn't a single link in a loyalty chain, but a node in an organizational network. For example, in developed societies, one can simultaneously be a union member, churchgoer, golf club member, and party supporter. Thus, each member's identity isn't fixed but fluid and multifaceted. Such societies may seem noisy with diverse voices but are actually highly stable and united. After all, your opponent in the union might be your golf buddy. Why fight bitterly? All right, we've learned political modernization evolves from low public participation and institutionalization to high levels in new systems. This new system features rationalized authority, specialized functions, and popular participation, adapting through complex organizations to become autonomous and united. So how can developing nations undergoing modernization achieve this? From our analysis, traditional societies feature low public participation and low institutionalization. Developed societies feature high public participation and high institutionalization. Observing developing nations, especially unstable ones, reveals high participation but lingering low institutionalization, an extremely dangerous imbalance. Both traditional and developed societies maintain stable alignment between public mobilization and political institutionalization. The most closed-off societies experience no political turmoil. Developed societies avoid fundamental upheavals too. The most vulnerable are nations transitioning from traditional to developed status. In these rapidly developing countries, economic growth spawns new social forces, especially urban middle class and industrial proletariat, but old power structures remain entrenched, unable to accommodate their demands. This leads to two outcomes: corruption of existing institutions and large-scale social unrest. In such cases, change comes either through top-down reform or bottom-up revolution. When rigid systems block new forces, they bypass formal channels through bribery, buying influence with officials to achieve their goals. This is the root cause of pervasive corruption in many developing nations. But the fundamental issue lies in the second outcome. Faced with mobilized masses, enlightened reformers must revitalize rigid systems to accommodate new forces, institutionalizing politics to match participation levels. Otherwise, urban radicals, intellectuals, and students consolidate new forces to launch revolutions. In this reform revolution race,
Farmers' attitudes decide the winner.
Developing nations' key feature is urban-rural imbalance. Cities generate new economic factors of production. Thus emerge the middle class and industrial proletariat. But in vast rural areas, old production relations still dominate. These majority farmers, pragmatic by nature, determine developing nations' political direction through their attitudes. They're not interested in abstract ideologies. Their main concern is practical benefits. Land. In political struggles, they support whoever gives them land. For reformers in developing nations, successful land redistribution to farmers is key to winning their support. For urban revolutionaries, winning over farmers is equally crucial to revolution's success. This requires revolutionaries to immerse themselves in rural communities, unifying coalition building to meet farmers' needs, building an alliance between urban classes and peasants. For revolutionaries, the deadliest enemy isn't government troops, but reformers within the old order. If reformers succeed in land reform, revolutionaries lose their foundation. The weak urban middle class alone can't prevail. After Russia's failed 1905 revolution, Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin clearly recognized this. Starting in 1906, Stolypin spearheaded land reform with an iron fist. The reform's core was redistributing nobles' communal land to farmers, creating individual farms. As Stolypin's aide wrote, Russia's tragedy was delaying land reform after 1861 serf emancipation. Farmers were free but landless, still subject to old harvest rules. Facing old injustices, farmers followed revolutionaries seeking change. Western Europe avoided Bolshevism because France, Germany, Britain, and Italy had established farm-based land systems. Stolypin himself believed his reform had seized revolution by the throat. Exiled Lenin acknowledged Stolypin's reform meant no revolution would succeed for a generation. Had Stolypin not been assassinated in 1911, Lenin might never have launched another revolution. Whether reform or revolution, both walk on thin ice, unleash massive social upheaval, and make political modernization's prospects highly uncertain. It's precisely why we say developing nations' scarcest resource is strong political leadership. So, does this mean no one in developing countries can step up to reverse the crisis and establish stable order? Um, Actually, no. The author believes at least two forces can provide stable political order: communist parties and militaries. Let's examine communist parties first. As American Political Science Association president, the author objectively analyzed communist parties' progressive role in developing nations. He argues their rigorous organizational systems offer complete alternatives to decaying old regimes. Developing nations' core problem: high public participation meets decaying systems unable to integrate new social forces or address their demands. But disciplined, autonomous communist parties can integrate emerging forces, achieving high political institutionalization. They organize youth through communist youth leagues, women through women's federations, peasants via farm associations, workers via trade unions, soldiers through committees, intellectuals via left-wing writers' groups, businesses via chambers of commerce, with party committees and congresses at all levels. This highly institutionalized system can accommodate virtually all emerging social forces. It operates on democratic centralism. Minority obeys majority, lower levels obey higher levels, whole party obeys central leadership. Decisions stem from rational central authority, a Leninist principle the author highly praises. For most developing nations, the challenge isn't seizing power, but first establishing a power center and effective political order. Consider failed examples across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. You'll see the author speaks truth. For instance, in some Latin American nations, rampant centralization, uncontrolled corruption, shattered government authority, and collapsed social order. In these desperate societies, the only organization that can stand up and sweep away all evils is probably the Communist Party. After revolutionaries like Castro and Che Guevara swept through with iron fists, Cuba became perhaps the only Latin American country without drug cartels or gangs, with a government serving the people wholeheartedly. The author even hints that for developing countries on the path to political modernization, rather than learning from the U.S. political system, they should embrace the Communist Party because America's context is too unique.
Oh, yeah.
It was inherently a capitalist system with no feudal conservative forces, making it hard to replicate. Most developing countries' social structures, development levels, and historical cultural traits resemble pre-October Revolution Russia. You need authority before you can constrain it. You need order before you can improve it. Now, looking at militaries, a common trait in developing countries is disunity. While the military is the only highly organized, professional, and autonomous social organization, 88 million. The military has a tight organizational structure, modern scientific knowledge, rational planning by the general staff, and decisive execution. With guns in hand, militaries in many developing countries play a stabilizing role. So, after establishing authority and order, how do we constrain authority and improve order? How do we evolve from an authoritarian polity to a modern one? The author believes the key lies in party systems, using party organizations to mobilize social forces, expand public participation, and then implement party politics based on that. Whether one party, two party, or multi party systems, military established authoritarian governments should ally with the urban middle class, especially intellectuals, after stabilizing, to transition into party politics. Examples abound. After seizing power, Iraq and Syria's Free Officers Movement transformed into the Arab Socialist Ba'ath Party and continued ruling. Myanmar's military government also reformed in response to democratization trends as the Union Solidarity and Development Party to continue participating in the political process. All right, let's summarize the author's point. Modernization is a good thing. It's good because it destroys old authority, awakens public political awareness, and expands political participation. But the problem is, modernization doesn't always create new political systems. The core contradiction emerges when outdated institutions can't keep pace with change or meet new participatory demands. This fundamental social contradiction is the greatest challenge for developing nations. To resolve this, developing countries must first establish political authority and order. There are two paths. First, existing ruling elites compete within the current system, mobilizing masses to reform institutions. Second, outsider elites organize masses to overthrow and rebuild the system entirely. It's one or the other. Political order in changing societies. That concludes our interpretation. Reading notes are below the audio. See you next time.